こんばんは.
Shab bekhair.
Good evening.
I'm Megumi. I'm half Japanese, half American, born and raised in Tokyo.
I'm Minsky from Tehran and living in Tokyo.
I'm Gemma from Australia, and I am living between Tokyo and New York. So, this is the first episode of Movement. It's a 6-part series for Room 303 that looks at the status quo and resistance to the status quo and confronts long-standing injustices in the places that we call home.
Over the next few weeks, we'll be looking at the creative ways that people have been reaching for what they deserve or what they've been promised from Tokyo to Tehran.
We'll be talking about things like violence in all forms, racism, imperialism, media control, women's rights, workers' rights, Zionism, and reframing monoethnic or monocultures. Today's episode is all about context. What is the situation on the ground and how did we all get here?
A big content warning on this episode and all our episodes because we'll be sharing some painful anecdotes and discussing very heavy themes. But the main message we want to convey is one of hope and resistance and the power of community. People united will never be defeated.
Before we start, I just kind of wanted to set the tone by sharing a quote with everybody. And it's also kind of related to our project itself, what we want to do here as well. It's a quote by Kelly Carter Jackson, who wrote a book on We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. She studied in uni about an abolitionist movement, and she teaches her students often in school, and she has this quote: "It's better to know where to go and not know how than how to go and not know where." All right. That being said, I think a great place to start is that, since this is also video form, some of us are masked, some of us are not. So maybe we can both talk about you, Gemma, Minsky, maybe share why you guys are masked, and I will share also why I'm not masked.
Sure. So, I want to talk really freely and honestly about what I think about the situation in Iran. And I think later on, broader context of maybe capitalism and a lot of other themes. And I think mostly I'm a bit afraid of my own government and the surveillance they might be doing. At the same time, I don't think they have the time to look into this type of content, to be very honest. But still, I don't want to lose sleep over that. So I think that's one. And two, I'm quite shy. I really enjoy just speaking my mind, not showing my face. That's it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I actually have a friend who is working at the ABC in Australia, our public broadcaster, as what is her role? It's kind of like a online safety sort of thing. And she was sort of if I had one piece of advice for emerging journalists now in this world, I would say start with a pseudonym, begin from that. There has been a time in my life where I have tried to make a name for myself as a writer and a journalist, but at the moment I am vying for a visa in the United States to try and live there, and it is such a surveillance state. And also in December last year, Congress passed some sort of resolution that equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And also it was recently some sort of FBI document was leaked to a journalist that said that anybody expressing sympathy for Luigi Mangione online may be added to a federal watch list. And perhaps I'm being overly cautious, and I do really stand by what I want to talk about in these episodes, but I also want to protect myself, and that practice of wearing a mask in the US when you are, going to a protest or engaging in any form of activism is being widely embraced, to the point where the US is trying to enforce mask bans as well, because they know that messes with facial recognition technology. So that's why I am choosing to wear a mask, just in case it bites me in the ass one day. Megumi, why are you unmasked?
Well, not so much of a, I feel, yeah. But yeah, absolutely. interesting takes on being masked and the reasons to it, and the whole being a writer and like having a pseudonym as well too. We talk about this often, I feel, but I wish I had a pseudonym. I feel in the past, like my early 2000 blogs are just so cringe that I'm like, oh my god, if you Google my name, it's like, oh my god, don't do it. But me even like pleading some editors, being like, please can you take this article down. But that being said, I feel like we will maybe touch upon it later on a bit more on like political consequences and whatnot, depending on state by state. But I just feel like as a Japanese person who lives in Japan, the consequences are just so much more. It doesn't exist so much, as opposed to if I say something radical or if I say something provocative that I don't know if it will affect me directly. I might be very naive and people might completely disagree with me, but that's kind of where I have grown up. I've grown up with, and I've known the world how that way. So yeah, that's why I'm kind of like, I'm not like, yeah, there's nothing to hide, guys. Like I'm not like sticking the middle finger up, but more so it's just like, I don't know why. I guess I should hide my identity, if anything. More so is kind of where I take it. Yeah.
Well, I guess we should start. Well, we've already started. I guess we should continue by asking the question: what radicalized you guys? Like, what kicked you off your interest in social movement and resistance more broadly? Minsky, can we start with you?
Yeah, I think for me, the amount of contradiction that even as a child I felt between what I internally believe, where and how things should be, versus what the external realities were, the difference was just so intense that I think from childhood, like certain things did not make sense to me. We can maybe later speak more about that, but I think since I remember, like earliest memories from when I'm 4, and like I kind of remember the mind space I was in kind of at the time, and over time I think the external reality of the society I grew up in was maybe putting me in a more disempowered space that I didn't internally feel like. So I think that was like maybe the kind of recurring theme for me. Always like radicalism came from where I think that the place that I was put in and I didn't feel like I belonged. How about you guys? Like, how about you, Megumi?
Well, I guess as an anecdote, what I will remember, the first thing is, which is absolutely not related to like any political movement whatsoever, but like probably when I was like 7, like in Japan we have a culture of like yorimichi, which is like basically straying away from like your regular home route, going back from home to your school or whatever. And I did that yorimichi one time, and then my mom got so furious, like, why is she not home yet? She should be home like 10 minutes ago. And she came like finding me. And I feel like that is a great representation of the society and the culture I grew up in, which is like conformity, societal like rules, rigid rules even, has kind of like structured like, oh wow, even like just kind of straying away from hometown for 5 minutes is kind of like, you just can't do that. And granted, like even my mother's like American, but yet we kind of grew up in like a Japanese cultural household. So yeah, that's kind of like the first thing that I realized, like what I did was a bad girl like thing. But if I can just keep on talking after this, okay. But I feel like it's funny because when I think about like radicalized or like anything that is like revolutionary that happened in the context of Japan per se, I'm like, oh, have I ever witnessed a revolution in my own country? Like, were my parents like activists? Which they were not. Like, they never even taught me like politics so much, I feel, honestly. But to my like knowledge, the image of like revolutionaries are kind of like kids like smoking ciggies in like a small room like this, and like they're plotting the next like best revolution ever, and like it's just like the greatest students of all are just gonna like go out to the streets and like create change. And that was kind of what I had in mind. But I guess my radicalness of it all is more so like practical and like, I don't know, personal. And not to say that like, I think the funny thing is I have something in common with those activists as well too, which every activist, every cause is very personal to them as well too. For me, it's always been, I think, very much like identity based growing up in Japan, I feel. And I have to look back at my notes, but yes, there's an essayist in Japan who's also a fellow hafu as well, and her name is Awa Ito. And I read her essay once where she said, like, it's not that rare for for a hafu to fixate on the idea of Japaneseness. And I really related to that idea because it's all about like Japaneseness is so specific and it's really particular, just like any other nationality perhaps, but it really has this form of there's no other way of looking or feeling or thinking other than Japanese than like this way. So I've kind of struggled with that by being biracial and growing up in Japan that way. I think a lot. Yeah, and later on, I think we will also touch on this a bit, but I think the mono ethnicity part, which is like in Japanese, I guess we will call it like Tanitsu Minzoku Se, is also kind of a false narrative where I think we should be reframing idea and like reframing culture as well too. And yeah, that's kind of how I sort of started my radical journey through like my own identity, I guess, and whatnot. But yeah, sorry, that was a long rant. But Gemma?
No, that was super interesting. I guess like my experience is different to both of yours in the sense that like it sounds like you were growing up in a society where you weren't benefiting from the structures that had been set up there, like presumably growing up in Iran as a woman, but also under an oppressive state, and like growing up in a mono-ethnic culture as somebody who like didn't fit into that neat little box. And I guess although like I grew up as a little girl and, you know, it's very, Australia is like absolutely a man's world and a boys club. And so growing up and realizing gender imbalances and getting mad at them. But at the same time, I grew up in a country that was like brutally colonized, where a system of white supremacy was set up. And like I am white. And so I was benefiting, or I am, sorry, still benefiting from that structure. So it has been like a gradual realization of the injustice and a gradual unlearning of that process. But in terms of what radicalized me, my parents are quite politically active. My dad's like a blue collar worker and was always very anti-police and like anti-Israel. And my mum is like a teacher who like, you know, works with marginalized communities and is like her union rep at school. So was very involved in like workers' rights and stuff like that. And I remember when I was a kid, when I was 7, my dad would like come in before I went to bed and would like tell me a bedtime story or like give me a talk about something, you know, this is what astral traveling is or whatever. And one night he explained to me what left wing and right wing was. And I was such a little kid that I just was sort of like, wait, what do you mean? Like, you know, is our next door neighbor right wing? Like what? They are? Like, why are you friends with them? Yeah. And like from then on, I feel like for me, everything became political, like sometimes to my detriment where I am unable to separate people from their politics. But yeah, as I grew up, that sort of just, I don't know, became increasingly stronger. But I think the thing is like an adult that radicalized me maybe the most was that like I sort of, even though I was like aware of injustices, I still was of the belief that the institutions in Australia were set up to look after me. And to some respects they are. We have like a relatively, you know, moderate democracy, socialist government compared to other places. But I did like a bunch of journalism that was against coal seam gas mining. And I came at it from a real estate perspective because I was trying to think of a way where it could get into mainstream newspapers but still be about like, you know, quite an environmental issue that wouldn't normally go in that sort of press. And I got super lucky. It was a story that ended up being published on like the front cover of newspapers across Australia and New Zealand. And my life for the days after that was really scary in that the mining company was calling me and threatening to like take me to court, and the press club, and threatening like the editor of the editor of the newspaper rang me to be like, you know, you've fucked up. Essentially, we're going to have to take all of these things down, like pull them off newsstands. And like, luckily I had recorded everything. So I had all of this evidence, but it was a case of like putting my social media on private and like looking at changing my phone number and all that sort of stuff and being like, whoa, okay, we don't have as free a press in my country that I grew up to believe. And like, now I totally understand that we don't, but that was my unraveling of that as an adult. Minsky, I'm curious as to like, were there any specific stories or moments where like you did rebel, and in what instances and what spaces were little girls and young women able to rebel and resist what was happening or what is happening?
Yeah, so I think the earliest I remember, which is quite funny because, all my family remembers that time and then they kind of laugh it off. So when I was 4, one day at a lunch, like weekend lunch with my grandparents, my parents were there, my aunties were there. I just announced to everybody that from today on, my name is Ahmed. And Ahmed in Iran is a boy's name, very old school, like maybe a grandpa would be called that. I don't know where I got the name at all. And looking back, I don't think it was like a gender thing that I thought, okay, I want to be identified. I want to identify as a boy. It was like a more like a mathematical equation almost. Because as a 4-year-old, I loved playing outside in the streets with all my friends, like girls and boys, and like we had kind of equal rights, as kids. The only thing that would limit us was our age at the time. But I was like looking around me and I saw like the older girls become and like women in my life. I was like, wait a minute, that math doesn't work. Like it doesn't make sense. Like every year I become older, like things I like to do would become more impossible. Like I saw like girls like, having to ask permission to go out, and not just because of tradition or like Islam or whatever. Like it was more about, oh, the society is sick, we need to protect our girls. So like you would be a lot more constrained, while like boys would be able to go out, or like the dress code, like men in Iran look completely like the way any man can look like. They can wear what they want to some degree, not like fully. But women, we had to cover up, and not like covering our faces, but there was a dress code. So my 4-year-old brain was like, I'm going to solve this by just joining the other side. Like I thought it's quite possible, just like call me differently and I'm one of them, because this one is like more loss than gain. So I remember, yeah, I was like, I don't, it doesn't make sense. I don't feel like that. I don't want to like lose my freedom. So I'm going to do that. And then they all laughed and was like, oh, that's new. And nobody called me that. Like there's no such thing. And, it wouldn't work in Iran. And, but I think that was like a kind of topic of my life, of like looking at people, like when I saw women got married in our relatives and families, like some of them quite early. It just in my mind, I like saw them almost disappear, almost like as an identity. And I don't say they did, but I think that was my young, like mind's take of what happens when you become a woman. You kind of disappear into this role of a mother and a wife. Yeah. So I think, that's the earliest one. I have more, but like we can maybe talk about it later. How about you guys? Do you have any like early, like instances where you rebelled or did something unexpected?
Maybe not. I was such a goody two shoes, but I also have a follow-up question.
Sure.
Like, what was your parents' attitude to that in terms of like wanting to keep you safe and having like sort of lived through the revolution and stuff themselves? Like, what was your parents' level of political engagement and level of resistance, and like trying to balance that with having kids that they wanted to protect?
I think they were going through a very tough time, because the way they grew up or what they were promised, like when my mom was in middle school, the revolution happened. So she went from having this life of looking up at all these teenage girls dressing up, going to like places like our own prom, and, just more maybe a secular type of environment, to suddenly going to high school, having to wear the hijab, and like completely the curriculum change in their lifestyles and everything. So they were confused first and foremost. So none of these, basically my grandparents' generation, my parents' generation, and my generation, we had very different lifestyles and very different education. And I think our parents had to maneuver, not telling us pretty much what they think or what they believe in, because they had their political. My dad got arrested during the revolution because he had some leftist inclinations, and like he went to prison for that for a while when he was a university student when the revolution was happening. and a lot of his friends got executed during those times. So he had his view of the government, which was not really a positive one. My mom, I don't think she like necessarily agreed with the status quo, but they were just trying to like have a family and like raise kids and work, and it was really confusing, and they couldn't really tell us what they think because early on in their young age, especially their time, government was really like the surveillance was crazy. So you could not talk about, you're not praying, like if your family doesn't pray or they don't believe in the government, it's a big deal. In our generation, I think it was a little bit looser. Like we wouldn't talk about it, but they were scared. Anyway, so I remember one time there was like the supreme leader, which is a funny name. I don't know a better name for him. So it's not like North Korea level, but he's a dictator. So the supreme leader was on TV. And I was really young. I looked at my dad. I didn't know his political inclination, nothing. I was like, Dad, is he a good guy or a bad guy? And my dad had the longest pause. And then he was like, you know, Minsky, people are gray. And like that was his best answer. I know now what he thinks. I think he really, the self-control and like how they were constantly living that life. So they didn't give us answers. They were not particularly religious. My like they kind of have like kernels of religion, I think, through family, but they were not praying. They didn't want us to talk about it. So it was like, I think as a parent, balancing that, not giving any kind of worldview or religious view in that country is very hard. So also we grew up quite confused as well, and we had to like figure it out ourselves like as well. Like there were times I was trying to, when I was like 9, I was really trying to get religious because that's what the school was telling me, and there was no message from family. So it's like reading, there's this part of Quran where it says, God did not enlighten the hearts of unfaithful or disbelievers, and another part says these people are gonna go to hell. And I was like, oh shit, like God did not give me that light, because I'm like trying to logically understand this thing. I'm fucked. sorry for the language. I really, as like a 9-year-old, I was like out of options. So at that point, I kind of think it took me some time, but I embraced the other side. But I remember every single thing like this. And I think my generation had to go through it. We had to kind of figure it out ourselves. There was not, a lot of people were coming from religious families, but even that, there were so many contradictions for them, the society and how they were raised. So yeah, I think it was a very difficult parenting time for everybody. Yeah.
Sorry, not to just keep having you talk the whole time today. It is fascinating, but like, just to point out what you were saying a little bit earlier on, like how the women were just, because when you wanted to change your name to a boy name because you realized so early in your life that you're like, okay, then I'm just gonna go on that side. It just seems more cooler.
Yeah.
Obviously, like life seems more easier. Did you feel like, as a foreigner who lives in Japan, like, did you felt like, obviously politically it's has such Iran and Japan a stark difference in like everything, but in terms of that kind of gender roles and stuff, did you feel any similarities in a way when you're like going through life? Because you went to uni here in Japan as well, too, just like kind of out of curiosity.
Yeah, so I think at first I was trying to figure out how things are, and I was very hopeful. Because the like kind of legal system in Iran, very kind of top down, like they are, it's very misogynistic.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. If you literally hit a person by mistake in an accident and that person is a woman, the amount of payment or punishment you have to pay is half of a guy. And that's just one of the many things. Like there's like a list if you look it up. So it's like very externalized. And at the same time, a lot of women are very educated. So people like my mom's generation or even us, it's so obvious that we know what we are fighting. We know what we hate. And a lot of women, they're like, wait a minute, I'm working outside. I'm working inside home. I'm doing all this thing. And then my life is worth half of a man. Like what the hell, you know? Like, so I think that was very obvious. But coming to Japan, I felt like a lot of these things that I deem as sexist here was a little bit internalized by the women. As like, I kind of felt like, oh my god, why are women not taking this as an issue? But then at the same time, I do like I thought, okay, maybe because it's a functioning-ish society in so many ways, it's easier to kind of internalize. For us, it's not functioning, and it's very external. But at the same time, I feel like, yeah, I just laugh about it. It's like coming from Iran to Japan. I kind of want to like find another space where it's like a lot more progressive for gender issues and see how it really feels to just live there. Because it's like we don't, none of these countries rank really high, and I do feel that. Yeah. How do you guys feel about like living here as women? And
Well, as somebody who travels through Japan and Tokyo, do you have something?
I don't really have much like contribution. Like I'm here so shallowly and for such short periods of time that I'm not like embedded in society or experiencing any of the like systemic inequality that might exist. But like you sort of touched on that notion of like, it's not political complacency, but like comfortability, I suppose, that comes when a society looks after its people enough so they don't necessarily have to rebel.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could speak to that in saying that like your parents weren't necessarily that politically engaged. And yeah, what do you feel like how political people are as a general rule in Japan? And I say this coming from a country where people are not that politically engaged in Australia either, because again, there's huge gaps, there's huge inequalities, but like lots of our basic needs are met, and people have sort of forgotten how Australia was colonised and what the state did to them. So now they're just sort of like, whatever, and they've like, resistance has died off a lot. What's the situation here in your experience of that?
Yeah, I mean, there is so much to rebel against, obviously, in Japan as well too. It's a good point to point out that like it is a functioning society in a sense. That's such a good thing to ponder and think about. Literally on a day-to-day basis, you just don't struggle. Like if you're like a working class person, even like it's just kind of like go to your work and like just do your job and come back home and do your thing for the next day, I guess. But I guess okay, I written down a sentence of like what is like the political climate in like Japan. This is how I would describe it, maybe, which is like mostly reserved, passionately purist, and fondly traditional. If that like if that is self-explanatory, I don't know. But basically, what I thought of that is that like reserved, as in yes, I mean we're a very conservative country, and it's been like that for a while now. We're not the most progressive way of thinking when it comes to gender, women's rights, all sorts of other issues on immigration. It's really hard to even have immigrants in Japan as well too. The way we treat foreigners, immigrants especially, is really harsh. Like again, this purist idea, and that's kind of like my second point, but like passionately purist is, I think it's just a nicer way of saying like some people are still quite nationalists kind of in a way. Like we don't particularly like celebrate our national holidays here in Japan, but if you live here enough, you realize that there are so many national holidays like per month, you know? And then every time there's like a Japanese flag that goes up in every single building, and then every holiday kind of signifies the day the country was built, the day that we ended the war or whatever it is. It's like I feel like every election that happens, even last year, or a Tokyo government election kind of pops up, there's always a couple people who are very eager about the idea of like, let's keep on this legacy of being Japanese and like this pure kind of this what like Yamato Gokoro, like samurai damashi or whatever, which is like this strong-hearted kind of ideologies that we had since back then. And it is kind of fresh to mind because just today we were kind of talking about this earlier with other people, that like Japan colonized so many other Asian countries in the past. And I do think that like that era specifically, when they were conquering or like colonizing these places, a lot of people still kind of feel like, yeah, Japan has never been colonized. We're like so pure in a sense. Like, I don't know if those two have ever been like directly kind of connected at all, but I do also sometimes think that Japanese people, at least the nationalists and the purist people who kind of like to fixate on the idea of this is what Japan or Japanese should look like, are kind of fixated on, which really, I think, takes us back and not moves us forward in time, I think, so much. And also the last bit is like just tradition, I guess. And that's kind of like what, if we all live in this country, we see that day to day. Like, there are beautiful parts of tradition that I really enjoy of Japan that is like handcrafted stuff and like so much regional tradition that must keep going and it should exist forever and ever. But also these traditions, some traditions also keep us back. Like, I mean, what, like, I guess it's not a tradition per se, but like what you were earlier mentioning, Minsky, on like how women should be married at a certain age and women should have a kid at a certain age, and like there's also an omiyai culture, which is like the marriage match, or what's it called in English? I forgot. The match arrangement. Yeah, arranged marriage. Like that's still a thing in some places, of course, and that's also kind of mostly because the parents are just kind of like, hurry, like you're gonna lose your eggs, or you're gonna like, we want grandchildren, or kind of like that. And I do think that these kind of backwards thinking of women should be this, a man should be this, a man should be the breadwinner, is still much a way of how we live society. Yeah, and I think that's where we're at. And when it comes to, again, like voting, the practical like voting parts as well, like Japan is like, it's a functioning country, and maybe people are not so much upset about the status quo when everybody's saying inflation, but actually when you go to supermarkets, like maybe because like I'm also seeing the currency in dollars and stuff all the time, but like it is really fun, like really, really cheap in Japan, I would say, when it comes to produce. And like, sure, the prices are raising, but it's still livable. The cost of living is really cheap. There is an issue of like the wages are very low, but the cost of living is also not actually going higher as well too. So there is that like kind of hand in hand thing there. But then there's also just things that are, it's just it's easy to live, I guess. But the voting rate, I think last year when we had an election, it was about 53% or so is what I saw. And mostly because it wasn't, and that was like maybe the third lowest since the war. And that was mostly because last year there was this stupid scandal between the politician, the LDP, our Liberal Democratic Party, which is not the liberals that the Westerners think. So confusing. But the LDP had the whole like political money scandal or whatever. And I think a lot of people were like, I'm not going to vote because I have distrust in the politicians or whatever. So I think that was maybe one issue. But yeah, I just think, I don't know. When I think about like voting rates being so low, not many young people going to votes anymore, is kind of like, are we really, I guess, maybe just satisfied with the status quo and we don't have a lot to change? When, well, certainly there is a lot that should change. I certainly don't want men who is a cabinet literally of 90%, let's say, is like the male cabinets of all. And like, I don't want them to think about my literally healthcare, to be honest, or my reproductive rights, or my birth control pill, or whatever pills that I have to take for myself. It's just like, I don't want them to have that control over me. I would love more women in the cabinet. Like, change it should happen for sure. But yeah, I think that's where we're at, where it's like, I wonder where the need or the motivation more so is not like, I guess, aggressive enough. Yeah. Okay. Digressing from the next question. I guess stemming from that of like where we're at right now politically, how would we sum up our, did we just talk about that though?
Which?
About like summing up our current status quo of where we live right now. Current status of where we live right now, I guess. Yeah, not just like politically, but just in general.
Yeah, well, I guess I've become increasingly more interested in how you can connect the dots through history to work out how you got to where you are right now. And I am curious as to what that has looked like in Iran. I'm curious as to what that has looked like in Japan. And in Australia, what our current society sort of looks like is that like, I think we have the highest rate of gambling losses per capita in the whole world, and like the greatest number of poker machines and all that sort of stuff. And that's got a lot to do with this sort of narrative that we're like the lucky country and people should like have a go, and like those cultural narratives. So yeah, we love gambling. We love drinking. There are extremely high rates of male violence, and that's male violence against women. So like men killing and physically assaulting their intimate partners, their mothers, it's primarily that, I guess, but also like daughters and random attacks. But also, men assaulting each other. And I guess like the way that people have connected the dots with that through history is that like Australia was brutally and forcibly colonized in the late 1700s. And so many of our Indigenous population were like massacred and wiped out. And again, of course, incredible resistance everywhere. But like it's very difficult to resist violence and like, gun technology and disease. And also like, there were so many instances where Aboriginal people were like, oh, hey, like we trust you. Like we'll come to your dinner party. Like, for example, I grew up in a town called Mudgeruba, and bar means place in the local language. And the story that I have learned about it is that when Mudgeruba was being colonized and settled, people invited the local Kombumerri people to come to a dinner party and fed them poisoned flour, and all those people died. And so Mudgeruba means place of lies. And that's like a name that the town, I guess, does not realize its connection to. And, it celebrates its name and it celebrates its history. So like we're built on the back of a genocide, and like also the way that Australia was colonized was that like prisons in England were filling up, and Britain was sort of in its mode of expansion, and they were sort of like, cool, this fellow Captain Cook has found Australia. Let's clear out our prisons and we'll send everybody there, and we'll force them to do like indentured labor to like build our country. And women were rounded up as like tamers and breeders. And it was like 80% men, 20% women, or less. And just this like extremely violent society. And we didn't balance our gender until 1976. So there were more men in Australia for such a long time. And that has created a culture of violence that we can still see so much today. And like, I don't know, to bring up an act of resistance, I suppose, that's like creative and inspiring, and one that I think is cool. Women weren't allowed to drink in pubs until I think maybe 1965. There were two, or maybe even later than that. It might have been 1970 or 73. But in 1965, there were two women in a pub in Brisbane, Mianjin, which is like near where I grew up. And they chained themselves to the pub, and they were like, we're going to stay in here and we're just going to keep drinking. And like that ended up like helping allow women to drink in pubs. Then the other thing about Australia is that we had this policy called the White Australia policy that again existed until maybe it was fully dismantled in 1974, I want to say. And it basically said that like when somebody wants to migrate to Australia, they will be given a test in any European language. And the people who were administering that test were told that if the person migrating to Australia is white, give them a test in English. If the person migrating to Australia is not white, give them a test in Welsh, or like just basically pick a language that you know that they are going to fail at that test. And like it was literally called the White Australia policy, but like the idea was to try and keep Australia as white as possible. So like now we're living through the legacies of that, where like Australia is still extremely racist, Australia is still extremely misogynist. And although there was so much resistance to the state, as I said earlier, in the earlier days, like, your average everyday white person, with the exception of like, we're having a housing crisis right now, but their lives are comfortable enough. And like, if some people did any activism in their life, it might have just been being an anti-masker at like a COVID protest in 2020, because maybe that was the first time that they had ever had their freedom or their rights impinged, and they were not happy about it. Yeah.
Wow.
Anyways, that's where I come from. And how we got there. What about you guys?
No, just before I forget this thought, but like to make, what was it, the white Australia policy or whatever, and like having it like white as possible, and like Australia is a white state or whatever. I felt like going off of that, Japan I think had a history of also making like, have Japan the most Japan, like let's not put in any foreign influence at all. It's like kind of the opposite, I guess, basically. But like the era of like sakoku, or like when we were just completely alone an entire time for a while, like we just did not, if anything, kind of resisted all form of religion in terms of especially Christianity as well too. And we even feared that that would kind of like plague the way we think. And like we were so obsessed with like, let's keep Japan. And I don't know, I just kind of thought about like Japan did kind of have that idea of like resisting foreign influence and culture at some point in their history as well. So yeah, I just kind of like thought of that as well before I forget the thought.
Absolutely, because I mean, it wasn't that many generations ago. Was it 1853 that like the US came and blasted Japan sort of open?
Not even the US, like
Portugal first.
Yeah.
But then what's that place at the bottom of Izushimo that?
Oh yeah. With the
Is that where the US arrived first?
probably, or the British.
Yeah, right. But yeah, like it wasn't that many generations ago.
Yeah.
So of course our cultures are going to still be so influenced by those narratives when they were like built into legislation or whatever. So yeah, that absolutely makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because like every time I try to figure out what is informing our current culture back home or in Japan, I feel like it just keeps going back and like goes deep history. But I think one thing in Iran that really shaped maybe the modern mentality of a lot of people, and I'm talking about mostly maybe older generation, like my parents' generation, was that Iran, like let's say 200 years ago or so, there was this guy who tried to nationalize Iranian oil. And he was the prime minister of the king at the time. We had a kingdom. And the kingdom agenda was to kind of make Iran, modernize Iran, and like, kind of open modern universities and, change the dress code for women. Because, Iran has always been traditional. And even before Islam, we had like thousands of years ago, we always had like very kind of big religions with different types of, I guess, mandates. But then, so that guy tried to nationalize the oil, and the reaction, or how the UK or Britain intelligence, office, or like CIA, they did a couple of things because they did not like that movement. And they kind of, paid some people to do a coup, and he was later on punished. And it didn't really happen the way I think a lot of Iranians or that guy wanted it to work. So, we had so many times where we were shaping like a democratic parliament, and again, people were paid. I'm not saying always there's like US and UK involved, but there was very active interest in Iran for obvious reasons. And before that, basically, the Great Britain had all the rights to our oil, and they would kick back off like about 15% or so of the revenue to Iran. And that was like kind of the math. And after that, there was the revolution in 1979 to overthrow the king, the second king, basically the son of the guy. And basically that was like peak revolution movement elsewhere as well. There were so many protests in like US, and like, there were more unions. I think it was a natural kind of global also movement. Despite King's effort, I think he was also still a dictator. So there were like a lot of new university students like my dad. They were like, screw this, we want democracy. Or some of them wanted communism, some of them wanted a more Muslim group, and then they revolted. And as a result, one of these groups, the Islamic kind of group, took over. They had the kind of most charismatic and available leader. So they took over, executed the rest of the opposition, despite that the revolution was like a joint effort to overthrow the king. And I think those instances basically every time we wanted to have a more democratic country, it kind of faced this failure. And I think that became the narrative. So my parents' generation, they never liked when they saw like us trying to figure out what things are like, or be activists or change things, because they were so sure, like the power imbalance was so harsh that they were like, no, get out of the country and just like live a better life. It's impossible here. Don't try to change things. It's impossible. So I think that was the narration. But like my generation, we were born and raised in the current regime. So this is all we know. They saw kind of a failure. We know of it, and we grew up by people who talk about it like failure. But for us, this is all we know. And I think the younger generation is a lot more loud and a lot more brave. And 2 years ago, we had the protest after Mahsa Amini died because of police brutality of like the dress code. And like a lot of people are young people in the street, and like Iran's average age is 32, pretty much my generation. It's like 90 million people, average age 32. Whoa. So that really makes me hopeful, but also it's going to be quite interesting, because those people who came from a very different narrative are no longer the majority. And I think that's also why you would see a lot of different movements and a lot of things coming out of Iran that could be like very kind of activist type rap, like street art, a lot of like people talking openly. Like our parents always, I think everybody parents were like, they were basically advising against such type of behavior. They were really scared for us, but that's really very quickly changing.
That's so hopeful.
Like, yeah.
Wow. Like I feel like we had a promise to like end each of our sentences or like topic when we finish. Like let's end with something like hopeful and like uplifting, because we are going to probably talk about issues that are like not great. But to hear that like the average age is 32, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And I guess in comparison, like God, like Japan's average age is, I don't even know, but it's probably like 60 plus or I don't know. But like it's just such a different like demographic. That's also, which is an issue as well too, and like birth rates plummeting, and that the government being like, oh, then we're going to subsidize the egg freezing program, because then women are just going to have babies all the way. And literally, like, that's not the solution at all. But yeah, what a hopeful way to, that's so cool to know that the young generations are like creating activity. And
I'm also curious, Minsky, like you left Iran.
Yeah.
But lots of your friends, I'm assuming, stayed. And have they stayed because they are committed in some way to, resistance or like dismantling the government? Like obviously Iran is their home and they grew up there and they love it and they don't want to leave. But what is the general consensus amongst your friends in staying, when I assume that some of them do have access to like the material privilege that would be able to afford them leaving?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a group of people which, I mean, internet, like the Farsi, Persian-speaking internet is full of memes about different types of Iranians. People who like have left, and then depending on where you left, you have like a category. But then the people who have access and did not leave, and then they have this like kind of phrase that we are going to build it again kind of thing, despite the oppression and despite what's going on. It's like every time I go back, I talk with my friends who are still there working. They don't make that much money. You know, even if you're from privilege, living in Iran is not easy at all. Like the inflation is hyperinflation. You cannot plan your life ahead like a year. It's like always hustling and trying, like almost like miraculous math. Like people joke about how it's just like I'm spending this much and I'm making this much and somehow life goes on, like somehow. And they actually make me a lot more hopeful, because there is definitely that body, and there are people who don't have, or it's not that easy to leave either, because Iranian diaspora, we're big everywhere, you know, like kind of Canada, US, Australia, not many people in Japan. But it's not so easy for 90 million people or the average 32-year-old to leave, you know, given our currency is also extremely devaluated. So, yeah, like, I mean, they definitely give me hope. They do a lot of things that looks quite progressive. And I have a friend who teaches kids philosophy in like a primary elementary school, like something like sometimes you don't see in developed countries that people care about. Or they do improv classes for kids. And yeah, like I think definitely that generation is doing their thing despite everything. Like, you know, people are not wearing, a lot of people who don't believe in hijab, they don't wear it despite the consequences that it might have. And they have this app that tell like kind of everybody that like there's police in the street, so like be careful, but they still do that. You know, it's very interesting. There's like literal tech around it, which I'm like always watching and getting excited about.
Like protecting each other.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
supporting each other.
Yeah, exactly.
That's incredible and so cool. And I saw something earlier, what with like Trump getting elected and promising to mass deport undocumented people, of which like I think there's maybe 11 million in the US at the very least, and like vast majority working very much and very important part of American society. And people being like, when you're driving in your car, like put on a blonde wig so then like the police won't pull you over, or like immigration police won't pull you over. And I just love the ways that people are finding ways to like resist and connect, and like that there's an app set up that's so genius and really cool. Really clever. I guess that's what's given me so much hope as well, like living in New York and just seeing so much incredible resistance everywhere. Like, you know, there's free Plan B at the local bookstore that I go to, and like I'm in a feminist paced up group about like domestic violence, and some of the women in that group work as paramedics. And when they go and do an ambulance call out, they'll like write the person who they're attending to's address down slightly incorrectly. Like they'll write the numbers on the street address wrong, so that like insurance has trouble chasing them up. And like just all of these little micro activisms and like mutual aid systems and stuff that are set up are just like so clever and so inspiring. And like, yeah, the people united will never be defeated.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is so cool. Yeah.
But yeah, like Megumi and I were talking earlier today about how like we don't really have any examples in history where people don't resist oppression, and like they may be, you know, forced into submission or subservience, but like nobody takes that lying down. And the more that we talk about the ways that people resist, I feel like the more we see a way out of it, I suppose. And like, yeah, living in Australia in this capitalist society where like I haven't seen a national liberation movement be successful because I've only been existing in this one, but like learning about those movements in other countries is just so inspiring. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe there is a way out of this.
Yeah, I think like honestly with this new kind of new world order, I think like very intense dictatorships like Iran and a lot of other countries, we are kind of like, I mean, despite the appearances, I think we have one or two lessons about how to resist impossible dictatorship. So I find that like obviously I'm not enjoying how like it's like on what the world is like going, but at the same time I'm like, oh, interesting, we have something to provide. Yeah,
totally. Megumi, do you have anything to add before we move towards closing out our show with a protest song? We were going to do that for every episode, just like finish with some sort of protest song or resistance song to highlight the hope, but also just to like have some music in there and not just us talking.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like I said most of what I wanted to say, but it seems repetitive because I also said this earlier. But recently I heard this thing where a revolution happens, but that's kind of not the point. What happens after a revolution is the point, and we must continue the work and change. And I recently saw a post on like when the ceasefire in Palestine happened, there was a post that ran around. I feel like everybody was liking it, but like we're sharing it on socials. But it was all about like, this doesn't stop everything. Like this is where the change must happen from here. But yeah, I just do think that there's change, there's hope, there's a lot of activist movement everywhere, and I do feel like in my life I haven't been involved so much in a lot of activist activities, but there is a lot of because we live in such a new world, as you phrased it, where just so much fucked shit is happening like on a daily basis, that it's just at a point where why like it's uncomfortable to not be a part of the change, I feel, if anything. So yeah, that's kind of what I guess as last words, parting words.
So the song we are going to listen to is by this guy called Shervin Hajipur from Iran. So after Mahsa Amini died and killed, it started a protest, a very big, like, kind of series of protests by people, which was quite bloody, and people died, got executed, or sometimes blinded by police guns. But basically what he did was he took all the tweets from these protesters. They would tweet why they're going to the streets and protest despite the dangers. And every verse of this song, the lyrics are one of the tweets. He just sang about it. And the lyrics are quite good. He kind of, I think he won first Grammy Award for Best Song for Social Change in 2023. And parts of the lyrics is basically like why you're going to protest, and he's just singing it. Oh, this is why. Or the name of the song is Baraye, which means for, F-O-R. I'm going there for. One is like for dancing in the streets, for labor kids in the street working while they need to be in school, for kissing my love in the street and not getting caught, for poverty, for execution, for Afghan immigrants who have no rights in Iran, and so many other things. So I really, truly suggest you guys watch the maybe YouTube video with the lyrics and the one that we are going to play now.
You've been listening to Movement for Room 303. Goodbye.
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره ای که میخنده، برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای قرصای اعصاب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی.